Hi, I'm Sharaad Kuttan and welcome to Let's Talk, the show that brings you the most important conversations, art, culture and ideas. Today we're at the Mutual Aid Project Gallery in Wisma Central in Jalan Ampang, part of an old shopping center. And I'm here with the curator, Eric Goh, as well as the artist behind the current show, which is What's Left for Gathering, Tan Zi Hao. Tan Zi Hao was on the show in January, you remember, for the Wawasan 2020 show at the Tun Perak Co-op. Thanks guys for joining me. So let's talk a little bit about who you are, since you're kind of coming into the space in the art scene and such. I mean, Zi Hao, you've been around for a long time and been doing quite a bit of work. So let's start with you. I mean, I know you just completed your PhD, but it's not in art practice, it's in art history. Would that be correct? How do you describe your work?
Well, I did my PhD in Southeast Asian Studies, and I was doing fieldwork in Cirebon, West Java of Indonesia, and I was looking into animal imagery in Islamic art, especially folk art, arts in the traditions, traditional folk arts. So, and then I have always been practicing artist. So immediately when I finished my PhD, I wanted to return to arts, and that's what I did. Right.
Can you help us understand? I mean, I understand the terminal degree for most as you're in art practice is an MFA. Would that be correct today? But there's also, I guess, new ways of thinking about academia and art practice. I mean, people actually make things rather than just write about it or do histories, right? So, is it important for you, or is there a connection between your academic interests and your artwork? I know it's a big question, but yeah.
Well, I think when I wanted to become an artist, I've always been quite aware that I do not want to study fine art to do arts. So I've always been interested in studying social science, humanities, reading books about philosophy, about cultural studies in particular, and to use this information, this theoretical lens to interpret the world. So it's not so much about studying art to do arts, but studying another field of discipline. And there is this process of translation that's involved in making the work.
Right. But I mean, I think as we talk about this, it's clear that you have a fine sense of composition and all the things we talk about, when we look at art and color and such. And Eric, so let's talk about you and your role as a curator, because that's also such an important part of the ecosystem of the art scene, isn't it? What are you studying now, and how does that relate to your decision to create this space here?
So I'm doing my master's in art history now in New York at the Institute of Fine Arts. It's part of New York University. And I've been practicing as a curator for the past 3 years now. And because of the pandemic, I had to come back last year in April. So I took a year off from school,
Right. You mean you didn't want to stay in New York, the epicenter of East Coast?
Given all that was happening,
no. Okay. Yeah. So again, what is the connection? There seems to be a little more of a professional connection between what you're studying and what you're doing. Could you help us understand, I mean, how and what the role of a curator might be in this context?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's quite tricky, because with art history, you're really thinking about history, right? Looking at objects, artworks, and thinking about the stories that they tell you, right? And the historical moments that these works maybe point us to. But with curating, it's slightly different. So you're working closely with artists and you're managing exhibitions. And more than that, I think it's about making speculative and imaginative connections between things. So it's not encumbered by, history necessarily.
Right. See how, there was that work that you did in Publica some years ago, and with to which I contributed, and if I can boast a little, where you had words etched on, and people might have seen that. If they go to Publica today, they will see some of them. Some of them are obscured. I think mine is obscured under a dinner table somewhere, but it doesn't matter. I think what is important is that you've been working at different mediums and working at different ideas. So tell us a little bit about how you came to produce this work. You said it was a kind of post-PhD funk thing, and then connecting with Eric at this space.
I think there's an underlying interest in most of my works is that about the idea of composites, about the idea of assemblage. And I've always been interested in looking at subjects that are a combination of foreign matters, a combination of multiple things. So when Eric invited me to work on a show, and it was also an encouragement, he was also encouraging us artists to think about the idea of slowness and smallness, especially because of this COVID-19 pandemic. So I immediately thought of two particular creatures that I've been thinking about in the past few years. That is a shell that collects foreign objects and a case bearer that also collects foreign objects to construct its case as a form of protection.
Oh, okay. Smallness and slowness. Slowness I kind of get immediately, right? It's kind of intuitive. The pandemic has shut our borders. We don't move around so much. We live, work from home now much more than we ever did. So, but smallness, why smallness? What does scale or size have to do? Is that how
Yes.
am I interpreting it correctly?
Yes. Well, the reason why I started this space was to work with 5 to 6 artists to think about the the conditions today brought about by the pandemic, right? So if you think about it, there are 3 sort of very obvious conditions here. Firstly, that the rhythm of daily life has slowed down. And secondly, the world has closed in on itself. And thirdly, there's more distrust and wariness between people, right? So 3 conditions are slowness, smallness, and wariness.
Wariness.
Wariness, right? Distrust, right? But I'm trying to think about how these things can be generative and not limiting. And so when we think about smallness, I think about, for example, when I was conceptualizing the space, I was reading this book by this botanist, Robin Kimbrough, and she writes about mosses. And she recounts this really beautiful story when she was in a forest with her students, but her students were looking at the horizon and never around them. And when an encroaching fog enclosed them, their world became small. They had to look at their feet, and that's when they realized there was this whole world of mosses. Its diversity and beauty were just there beneath them, right? And so I like to see this space as doing that as well. How smallness, although the space is physically small, the ideas exceed the confines of the space.
Right. And of course, that's very interesting because while these objects that you're looking at, Tan Zi Hao, are small, there is no reason to render them small, right? In an art gallery, in fact, the tendency is to do everything large. I mean, there seems to be a fetish for large-scale works, and I think it's a decades-long fetish, really. So your choice to kind of take something small and keep it small is very interesting to me. And one of the things that we see is how you allow us to view the object under a kind of microscope, And I find that fascinating because with the naked eye, I could only see gray, but actually looking very close, there's so much color. So what is it, if you could tell us a little bit about that? I mean, some of the choices that you've made in dealing with the objects that you're working with.
I think particularly for the household case bearers, it is something that, especially when you're staying at home, it becomes quite relevant because it just shows, it reveals itself. When you're staying at home, you will find this, what we so-called household pest, right? But if you begin to observe them, they are quite interesting creatures because they gather particles of soil and dust that you have discarded, right? So these gatherers, they do so, they gathered something from their environments because of camouflage, primarily visual camouflage, so that they blend with the environment, they blend into the environment.
Are they tropical, particularly, specifically a tropical kind of creature? Because I know I've seen them. I'm much more impressed by the cicak poo droppings in my own house, but I don't have many of these creatures, but I think everybody would recognize them. Are they tropical? Is it where's
They are tropical creatures, but there are also other species of bagworms or case bearers outside of the tropical areas.
All right, case bearers. So it's like they carry a case with them. Is that what it is?
Yes, they carry a case. They are like caterpillar, and when they're mature, they'll grow into a moth.
Right. How much of a conversation does a curator like you and Zi Hao, the artist with these ideas? I mean, is there a lot of toing and froing in terms of how the work is going to go? Do you basically take on a complete work?
Well, I think firstly that there's a lot of back and forth, and I started speaking to him last year in July or August. And the idea with this project, again, is to embrace open-ended conversation and discourse. So when we first met, we had no idea what we were going to work on, but the idea is to keep talking first, to get to know each other, and to talk with each other, and then see what are some of the interesting ideas that both of us are interested in. And in this case, it so happened to be these two species, right? Because they allow us to really think about coexistence, hospitality, the merits of embracing foreigners, especially with what is going on now with the pandemic.
Right. I mean, one might have, I don't know if I know you've had quite a number of people visit the gallery, but maybe people might have wanted to brush away the little creatures on the wall, because it does look like something that really shouldn't be there, especially in a gallery. So what for you, from the artist's point of view, I mean, Zi Hao, does the involvement of the curator make them a co-author of the work? I mean, how do you see the lines, and how do you draw the lines between your own imagination, your impulses, and the curator's sense of things?
I think when you have conversations with curators, the curators will tend to give you prompts, and I think that's very useful, especially coming from Eric. They're useful prompts in that they challenge us the way you think about certain things, because when an artist was doing research about a particular subject matter, right, you begin to narrow down your views on these very specific subjects. So I think what Eric has been very useful in doing is that he brings me back up, giving that distance and also looking broader, considering the current situation and also the concept as a whole. I think that has been useful.
Was there any conflict? I mean, did you, at any time come to blows? Did you want to break off the relationship? Were there points of, was there any, is conflict a necessary, to use your word, generative emotion in a relationship between a curator and an artist?
Often there are conflicts, but in this relationship, working relationship, I don't think we encountered any, though there were productive tensions and disagreements. But I think, with any form of knowledge production, it requires exchange, right? And that's the role of a curator, to draw out nuances of our conversation, our arguments, and the ideas that we have. And also, if you think about it, even great writers, they don't write in solo, they have great editors behind them. And I think the role of a curator is sort of similar to an editor, though it does more.
Right. Could you describe some or one of those points of contention, just to illustrate what is the conversation like between an artist and a curator? Were they? I mean, could you think of any specific moments?
Okay, for example, do we talk about the illustration? Okay. For example, Zi Hao does different things, and his artwork is quite conceptual, but he's never really exhibited illustration as artwork. He illustrates, but for zines. And that's because he's very aware of the ethics that comes with representing something, right? Because when you try to represent something, you're foreclosing other people's ways of seeing that particular thing. But I think in this instance, through our conversations, I think we try to sort of theorize our way out of this situation in order to resolve it by thinking about illustration not as a way of foreclosing ways of seeing, but of opening ways of seeing. Because in his illustrations, he's really thinking about speculative, imaginative species of household casebearer and carousels. Ultimately, there's something about believing things only when you see them, right? So illustration becomes necessary at this point. And because of that, I think the illustration opens our ways of seeing.
Right, and what was your pushback? I mean, what was it your concern? Was it the work, the speculative drawings, the one that imagines this creature in the future with, as it were, debris from the present, or much more kind of straight, kind of almost scientific illustration work that many of us have become familiar with?
Yeah, I think partly the contention comes from my previous works, because previously I've been thinking about mostly conceptual works. So I've never shown my illustration. So this exhibition was actually the first time I've showed my illustration as the actual work. And Eric has been very helpful, convincing me that this should be seen as part of it, because I'm also speculating possible futures about fictions, because the show in general is about the weaving of theories and fictions as well as histories. So in that sense, illustration, showing illustration as a form of art becomes more acceptable for me, which was more comfortable as a conceptual artist.
Right, okay. We'll take a short break and we'll be back with more on Let's Talk. Stay tuned. Hi, and welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm Sharaad Kuttan. I'm at the Mutual Aid Projects Gallery in Wisma Central in Jalan Ampang. I'm with the curator, Eric Goh, and the artist showing here what's left for gathering, Tan Zi Hao. And we've been talking about art and curation and the relationship between those two elements in the art ecosystem that kind of express themselves in this show. I'm going to turn to Eric and ask him a little bit about the space, because it's a fabulous old-style shopping mall, kind of reminiscent of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, the 70s and 80s, isn't it, Eric? I mean, could you tell us a little bit more about Wisma Central?
I think this was built in the 80s, and it was just this and Ampang Park and maybe Permata Complex as well, one of the few shopping complexes then. And then in the 90s and noughties onwards, all the high-rises came about, and then these buildings became a bit ignored. But it has a really fascinating history. It used to overlook the horse racing course, and there are apartments above the building, so you had a lot of people coming here as well to maybe sometimes look at the horse racing match from above here. So a lot of the tenants are quite old here. They've been here for like a long time. You have tailors. You have all sorts of shops, really, eateries, and a lot of the office workers come here for lunch.
Right. But what's also telling about the style of shopping centres of this era as compared to the shopping centres of today, of contemporary times, is their sense of space, because they tend to be they're almost bazaar-like, they're warrens, they're small lots, and I think that's probably the reason why you can get a space like this. Could you help us understand why you thought this might be a location for an art gallery?
Well, when I came back and I was scouting for spaces, I looked at Chowkit and then a few other spaces in KL Centre, and this happened to be one of the cheapest spaces. But more than that, also, it's so centrally located. And many years ago, I think the management tried to turn this into an arts hub, but it failed. So I felt like me coming back, I was also trying to figure out why it's failed and what it means to have an art space in this building where the tenants and the neighbors might not necessarily be part of the art world or know much about art. Yeah,
I mean, this idea of bringing art into a retail space to increase footfall is very popular, and I've seen, we've seen theaters in malls and so on and so forth. Zia, do you have a take on this? Real estate developers, their view of art and how it might function in terms of retail. Is that something that bothers you as an artist? I mean, are you a purist that wants a pristine white cube to work in?
Well, I feel that the complicity of art in a market is always there. So the artists have to be aware of that. And at the same time, you need to know that the artworks that you produce will fit into that cycle of neoliberal cycle of art consumption for the elites, perhaps. So then with that context in mind, with that pretext in mind, then what kind of works do you produce? What kind of knowledge production, right? That I feel is the responsibility of an artist. How do you challenge that? And at the same time, it's also important for artists to do something else outside of the role of an artist, because knowing that there is this limitation of the arts and market, then it is important to also do something that is beyond the art circle to challenge the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, these two works and these two creatures themselves are kind of interesting in that one's a bottom feeder of some sort, and the other really is would probably be degraded as some just actually part of the debris of a house, right? I mean, it's not even considered a creature in its own. It's kind of an encumbrance to the beauty of a home and the pristine nature of a wall, perhaps. So the fact that you elevate it and you tie it to all these other ideas about living in home and the environmental crisis that we seem to be rushing headlong into is very interesting. how do you make choices, Eric, about who shows here? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the previous shows, and is there some thematic, is there continuity thematically, or is there, how do you make decisions about who shows here? Apart from size, because clearly size does matter.
So I'm working with 5 to 6 artists, and the 5 artists are Arina Ang, Dipali Gupta, Izzat Arif, Zi Hao's the 4th, and then Fanchon next, and potentially Stephanie Bird from Singapore as well, if we're allowed to travel. But I picked them because I know them to various stages of sort of intimacy as friends. And part of this project was me trying to understand human relationship better, and hence mutual aid, trying to think about friendship, what it means to work together, and to relate to each other meaningfully. And so with each artist I chose, they're in different stages of their life. Dipali, for example, on top of being an artist, she's also a wife and a mother, which means I have a different kind of relationship with her than I do with someone like Zi Hao, who's younger, or someone like Arina Ang, who's the youngest artist I'm working with. She's in her early 20s, so naturally, all these kind of relationships require me to sort of relate to them differently.
Right, and therefore mutual aid projects. Oh, that's very interesting. So it's about the community that you created. Zia, do artists, and yourself really, enter into these communities, willingly? Is it something you see that's necessary? Because, there's a long tradition in the 20th century of artist communes and artists organizing around ideological positions and working collectively and so on and so forth. Is that how you see yourself as an artist?
Not necessarily tied to that legacy, but I think it is important for artists, or actually for anyone, to have conversations about ideas, because we seldom have the opportunity to have conversations about ideas and subject matter about philosophy of life in general. And I think art is always a very wonderful and open platform to actually talk about very fundamental things in life that you often neglected when it comes to, because of this careerist market that we lived in today.
Right. Talking about ideas, does mutual aid projects have a manifesto? And I ask this because manifestos were so central to 20th century art, right?
Well, no, I guess Manifesto is quite strong. It does have an intention to it. And the name is actually based on a book by this author, Peter Kropotkin. And he was, this Russian anarchist. And the book was published at the turn of the 20th century. And in it, he looks at the natural world and sees how, in fact, animals thrive because of cooperation and not because of competition. So it's also, and I turned to this text because I thought this was a timely moment to revisit that text and think about how equally it is cooperation that will get us through the pandemic and not competition. And it's also, a kind of resistance against neoliberalism today.
Oh, that's very interesting, because there's, of course, vaccine nationalism and all the things, the bad things that we hoped we would put aside to deal with the crisis that in fact have been exacerbated and amplified, right? So vaccine nationalism is one of the things, xenophobia is another. And so maybe we could talk a little bit more again about your art, Zi Hao, and how the kind of issues that you want to address through them. You've already described a little bit about the mechanics of those creatures and what they're trying to do, but what is it that you're trying to relate that to, what their life and to the larger world?
I think, this show is called What's Left for Gathering. So it's basically about these creatures literally gathering what is left on their surroundings. And I think this is an important thing because it tells us something about coexistence, about a mode of living today, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic situation where you have xenophobia and you have racism increasing across the globe. Especially for carrier shell, the name is called xenophora, so literally it's the carrier of foreigners, carriers of strangers. So for them, carrying these foreign matters are integral to their living. It's part of their survival strategy. So by looking into this, it's basically tells us how to look otherwise, how to think otherwise. And I think the power of art lies in that, right? It teaches us to see things in a different way.
Right, so empathy, mutuality, very interesting ideas. the last minute or so that we have, Eric, what's next for Mutual Aid's project?
So this was only conceived as a year-long project. So the next exhibition will be with Hu Fan Chun, Penang-based artist. And then I'm going to wrap up the project, and I'm working on a publication to talk more about the artists I work with and why start this space, and that's the plan so far.
Oh, do you have can you give us a sense of what might emerge in the gallery at the next show?
So we're thinking...
Or is it a secret?
I can reveal a bit. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So Fan Chun and I are thinking about the importance of fish dish on the dinner table for most families, but also for a Chinese family. It takes on a specific sort of cultural significance, right? Memories of going to like maybe restaurants in Pudu and having this fish dish on the table, and how that's the one thing we look forward to. And I think we're trying to unpack sort of layers of history and a culture just from that.
Okay, I'd like to see how you put this together, because this space is not big enough to fit a Chinese restaurant family dinner table, right? Just you can't get 20 people around a table in this space. But anyway, thank you guys so much for sharing all that you have about the show, and also the work that you do as a curator and the work you do with the space. So that's all we have on Let's Talk this week. I've been speaking to Eric Goh from Mutual Aid Project at Wisma Central, and also Tan Zi Hao, who's an artist whose work, What's Left for Gathering, is showing here. I'm Sharaad Kuttan, and this has been Let's Talk, only for Astro AWANI.